Welcome back. You're still watching the Daily Debate, and I am honored to be having with me over the program for tonight Mr. Tarek Refaat, the journalist at the Middle East News Agency. Thank you very much for being with us tonight.
Thanks for having me.
Anytime. First of all, as we did see in the past report, and of course the main topic for tonight is that Egypt and the United Nations are celebrating the 75th anniversary of joining the peacekeeping missions in specific, and of course this in its role helps in achieving stability and security for the region and internationally as well. First of all, how would you see the role of Egypt internationally on the diplomatic level in terms of having bilateral relationships with the United Nations, for example?
Of course, these are noble sacrifices made by the Egyptian military and the police, and it's an honorable duty to establish international peace and stability over the past decades. Egypt is one of the founders of the United Nations peacekeeping system since its establishment, and it's, as the report said, it's currently the sixth largest contributor to the forces and the missions of the United Nations.
Yes.
The Egyptian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the United Nations celebrated the 75th anniversary of the UN peacekeeping in the premises in Cairo, reflecting the recognition of Egypt's magnificent and extraordinary contributions to international peace and security. And also, this came also in Egypt, in the premises of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and also in New York, where they witnessed the celebration. Egypt contributed to more than 30,000 peacekeepers, including females and males and even civilians.
On a yearly basis?
No,
or
since
over
the past decades.
The past decades, yes. You've mentioned that, according to the report as well, Egypt is the sixth biggest contributor in terms of manpower for the peacekeeping missions to the United Nations over the past 75 years. What does this say about the strength of the military of Egypt?
Of course, the Egyptian military is one of the top 10 militaries in the world. It's known to be one of the strongest armies, and it's always defending the country and not trying to interfere in other countries. However, or on the contrary, it's trying to help establish peace, yes, in nearby neighboring countries or in Africa or elsewhere.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned Africa and the Middle East and the Mediterranean as well. What is the role of peacekeeping in terms of the role of Egypt in specific, in particular, in terms of having security and stability for the region and the positive repercussions of such a step for the region?
Egypt has a pioneering role in the peacekeeping. As you mentioned, it is the sixth largest country which contributes to peacekeeping with the rates of participation from both women and men.
Yes.
Egypt, when we saw the Libyan crisis, we saw President Sisi. He came out and he put a red line, Circle Jufra, and this really helped establish peace and helped the parties sit together and speak about a resolution in Libya. And the stability of Libya is also the stability of Egypt and the whole region. Mm-hmm. Because each and every country in the Arab world or the Middle East or Africa, you have trade agreements with them. You have tourism with them. So any country which has a crisis will definitely affect other neighboring countries regionally or internationally. Like we saw the Russian-Ukrainian crisis, it's far away from here.
Yes.
But it's affecting the grain, and it's making a food crisis all over the world. So Egypt and the African leaders, we saw Prime Minister Madbouli, he visited Russia to, along with other African leaders,
Yes.
to help solve this crisis, because it's affecting the African continent.
Even President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi
Yes,
was
of
in
course.
St. Petersburg a couple
Yes.
of weeks ago to be participating in the Russia-Africa
Africa.
summit as
Yes.
well. Returning to the main topic, you mentioned that the peacekeeping missions, they have a role in terms of settling the crises, settling the conflicts, and more specifically in Africa, as Egypt is situated. How do you see the role of the peacekeeping missions in keeping the peace, and if there are conflicts, they would be helping in inaugurating them?
Yes. You can, when you have arms or an army and you want to establish peace in a country, you could be doing it in the wrong way.
Yes.
So Egypt and the United Nations peacekeeping missions, they use a tactic which is not forcing peace, but helping to establish peace, helping to resolve crisis between the countries. Because when you have, sometimes we see accidents. We have peacekeeping accidents. The missions, they have accidents. So you need not to enforce peace, but rather to be aware of the area that you are in, be aware of the citizens that live there,
Yes.
their culture, and how to deal with them.
The traditions that are going on there.
Of course.
How to settle the crisis according
According
to their
to
norms and traditions, yes.
Yes. And not only politically or socially, you have to look at it in an economic way, in a social way. And after settling the crisis, how will you help those people socially and economically? And this is the best way to force peace, through raising the standards of living of citizens in the area.
Mr. Tarek, you mentioned that Egypt has provided about 30,000 troops over the past 75 years, maybe since 1916, over 24 countries in Europe, in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia. So what are the priorities of those troops going to the UN peacekeeping missions, in your opinion, from the point of view of Egypt?
Egypt has always had a very respectful and noble role when it comes to peacekeeping. When it started in 1960 in Congo and many other African countries through the decades, Egypt helped through the United Nations missions to establish peace and to solve crisis in many African countries and other Latin American countries. It's around it. Egypt has been on these missions since the 1960s, and it has been in around 8 or 9 countries, solving crises and civil wars. Yes. And so on. So the main objective of Egypt is an honorable role. It tries to help the country settle its crisis through through special programs.
Yes.
Yeah, and Egypt also established this Cairo International Center for Peace. And it's in cooperation with the Arab League, the African Union, and the United Nations. It's training, it's concentrating on training civilians before pushing them into missions.
Yes, regarding the priorities of Egypt upon deploying thousands of troops over the past decades, is it more about the humanitarian aid and relief and the assistance to the people, as you mentioned, and the citizens living there in Africa and Asia according to their culture, to their traditions, to their norms, or is it more about the field operations?
As I told you, it's not only about field operations, because one can think that a military is only the military only puts its strategies based on the field, but everything changed now, because it's not only about strategy, it's about the economy, it's about the social structure of this country. So it's not only about the field, but now the army is also studying other like they are studying strategy and statistics and many other fields. So it's not only about being on the field, but it's everything around it too.
Mm-hmm. In terms of the role of Egypt and its affiliations with the United Nations in general, not just the peacekeeping missions, how do you see the bilateral ties between Egypt and the United Nations and, of course, the affiliate organizations to the United Nations?
We have this MFO. We had the director of the MFO. She visited, as I told you, this Cairo International Center to review
Yes.
the rates of participation, and she also affirmed the appreciation for the center's activity and diversity and her keenness to cooperate with this center.
Mm-hmm.
So this MFO is basically, it was founded after the 1973 October War, and it's not really affiliated with the United Nations, because we saw during the 1967, we saw that when the United Nations were asked to leave the country,
Yes.
so they thought that maybe we could have another peacekeeping missions which is funded not by an international organization, but the MFO is funded by Egypt and the United States and Israel after the peace agreement was agreed upon. And I think some might not know about this MFO, but I think it's one of the most successful organizations. It's working dynamically in a different way other than the United Nations peacekeeping missions.
It's mainly in Sinai between
Yes.
Egypt and
Yes.
Israel. I think
Yeah.
Saudi Arabia as well. In the same region or
yes.
area.
Yes. So this is one of the organizations which is working in Sinai, and it's very successful. And the director visited the International Center for Peace, and she wants to cooperate with the Center for Peace.
Yes, in 2018 as well, we have had here in Cairo the roadmap for the peacekeeping operations to be improving the levels of the peacekeeping operations and the impact of those operations. How do you see the importance of having such a roadmap and the measures already taken? Because it was in 2018, now we are in 2023. How would you see the positive impacts of such a roadmap?
Of course, before you need to make a plan and have a roadmap before making any resolution or coming to any solution. So I see a very good progress since 2018 until now,
Yes.
and we are looking forward for more progress during the coming period.
Mm-hmm. Yes, in terms of the cooperation in general between Egypt and the United Nations, because the United Nations, it has a lot of sectors, a lot of affiliates, and they are working here in Egypt in different fields, in the field of health, for example, in the field of development, the UNDP, for example, here in the country. How would you see this cooperation over the years? Because one example is the peacekeeping operations. We have been keeping this up for 75 years. This means that we are a successful partner as well in this balance.
Of course, Egypt is one of the most successful partners of the United Nations peacekeeping, and with the United Nations as a whole. You said we have the UNDP. It's making very good programs with the Ministry of International Cooperation here in Egypt, and also you have the UNICEF. You have very successful organizations which Egypt managed during the past decades to work very well and cooperate very well with this with the United Nations.
Yes, Mr. Tarek, and on this note, we will be heading to the other report of the daily debate for tonight, as Egypt and the United Nations, they have signed both the Sustainable Development Cooperation Agreements over the past period. We have more details in the upcoming reports, so stay tuned.
Egypt has signed a new United Nations Sustainable Development Cooperation Framework Agreement with the United Nations to achieve Sustainable Development Goals (SDGs) by 2030. The signing ceremony was attended by Prime Minister Mustafa Madbouli, UN Resident Coordinator in Egypt Elena Penova, and representatives from development organizations, specialized UN agencies, ministers, and officials. Prime Minister Madbouli asserted that the signing is a culmination of Egypt's and the UN's developmental relations over the years, highlighting Egypt's role as one of the founders of the organization in 1945. For her part, Panova said she is happy to report the mobilization of the UN system to come on board. 26 UN entities based in Egypt have jointly worked on this cooperation framework and signed the agreement. 7 additional UN agencies that have not participated in the last framework joined other agencies under this year's agreement. In 2018, Egypt had signed a 5-year partnership agreement with the UN under the United Nations Partnership Development Framework. The UNPDF was fully aligned with Egypt's Vision 2030 and the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Panova stressed that the UN General Assembly resolution has identified cooperation framework as the most critical instrument for planning and implementing UN development activities at the country level. The framework unpacks the 3 dimensions of sustainable development, including social, economic, and environmental dimensions. It includes a dedicated outcome area on the empowerment of women and girls and a new priority area on transparency, good governance, and the rule of law. Egypt has begun implementing an economic reform program with the support of its development partners, Madbouli affirmed, citing Egypt's program's alignment with the UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, as well as UN-affiliated national strategies. The reform program included several social protection measures targeting groups that are most in need, citing the expansion of Egypt's cash transfer program Takaful and Karama, which already provides support to millions of families. The government has also increased pensions and wages, adopted tax exemption for low-income citizens, and provided various forms of support for basic goods and services. Furthermore, Madbouli asserted that Egypt is aware of the challenges that still exist, stressing the unprecedented shocks received by the Egyptian and global economy due to COVID-19 pandemic and the Russian-Ukrainian crisis. In response to these shocks, he said the government took swift and decisive measures to stimulate economic activity as well as strengthen social protection programs. Madbouli emphasized the importance of the African continent, highlighting that it comprises 71% of the world's least developed countries, which requires more collaborative international efforts and multilateral projects to strengthen its private sector, human capital, and infrastructure. For her part, Panova said that we signed this cooperation framework at a crucial moment for Africa and for Egypt. She noted that the African continent, particularly Egypt, is currently experiencing a series of interrelated crises that jeopardize hard-won development games for both present and future generations. The United Nations Sustainable Group website states that the UNSGCF represents the UN Development System's collective effort to support countries in addressing key sustainable development goals, priorities, and gaps. It begins and ends with an analysis of the national development landscape and SDG priorities, including through the lens of imperative to leave no one behind. According to the UNSGCF document, the framework also provides guidance to UN country teams as they plan, finance, deliver, and evaluate their support to countries in achieving sustainable development goals, typically over a 5-year cycle.